Hi everyone, it's me. Welcome to my channel and thank you for joining me here at the Old Jail Museum. Today we are going to talk about an outlaw from the Old West who was one of the most prolific train, stagecoach, and bank robbers of his time. He had a long list of victims all over the western United States and even into Mexico, and his gang of renegades made him a wealthy man. But now his story has come to this dusty old jail cell here in the Oklahoma Territory. That's right. This is the cell that housed the infamous train robber Bob Dalton. So let's get started. Okay, so where did famous train robber Bob Dalton spend his last days? Well, it was right here in this very jail cell in the Oklahoma Territory. So he spent several months in this little concrete cell before being transferred to the state penitentiary in McAlester, Oklahoma. And that's why this museum is dedicated to him. So Robert William Dalton was born in 1862 or 1863 in an area known as Round Gap in the Boston Mountains in Arkansas. And there isn't much known about his early life except that his family were poor farmers. Now, not long after he was born, his father left the family and his mother moved with the children to the nearby town of Altus, and she married a widower named John Davis, and they had 3 more children together. Now, Bob was one of 7 siblings that grew up in this household, and he learned to ride horses and hunt with guns. And when he was a young teenager, he was working in the mines and doing farm labor. But Bob was always restless and looking for a new adventure. Now, according to legend, when Bob was just 14 years old, he killed a man in self-defense, and then he fled to Indian Territory and lived with a Native American tribe. And some accounts say that he stayed there for 3 years, learning their customs and survival skills. Now, while living in Indian Territory, Bob met a group of outlaws, and he joined them robbing trains and stages. And the first major crime that he was involved with was the robbery of a Missouri Pacific Railway train. And it was during this event that he earned the nickname Bob the Spider. And he got this name because he used a rope ladder to climb into the train cars and escape with the loot. In 1879, when Bob was only about 16 years old, he was arrested for a minor offense, but he escaped while awaiting trial. And then later he was charged with raping a woman, but he escaped from jail again. And then in 1882, he was finally convicted of a crime and sentenced to 5 years hard labor at the Arkansas State Penitentiary, but he only served 6 months of his sentence before he escaped again. And so this was his life. He would join different gangs and commit crimes with them, then get captured, escape, start a new gang, and just keep on doing the same thing over and over. He robbed passenger trains, freight trains, stagecoaches, banks, and anything else that he could get his hands on. And he continued to escape from law enforcement until 1897, when he was finally killed in a shootout with Texas Rangers. But along the way, he worked with some of the most famous outlaws in history, including the James Younger Gang, the Wild Bunch, and the Dalton Gang, which was made up of his brothers and brothers-in-law. And speaking of his brothers, when you think of the Daltons, most people think about 3 brothers, Grattan, Bill, and Bob. They were known as the Dalton Brothers Gang, and they terrorized Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, robbing trains, banks, and stagecoaches. In fact, in September of 1892, they attempted to rob a train in Coffeyville, Kansas. The problem was that the train had 2 locomotives and the Daltons could only kill 1 engineer. So the train kept moving, and then they ended up killing 4 people in the shootout, including a policeman. And then they took hostages and rode into town. Well, the citizens formed a posse and gave chase, and in the end, 3 of the Dalton brothers were dead, including Bob, who was only 31 years old, and 2 others were wounded. Only Grattan survived, and he tried to claim that he wasn't involved in the crime. He was just visiting his sick brother Bill. But the townspeople didn't buy his story, and they whipped him and then shot him. But before he died, he confessed and implicated other members of his gang. And that led to the arrest of 22 alleged members of the Dalton Gang. So Bob Dalton was killed in the shootout in Coffeyville, Kansas, but his body was taken to a funeral home in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and embalmed. And then his body was sent back to his hometown of Siloam Springs, Arkansas, where he was buried. Now his body was buried in the family cemetery, and it was later moved to the West Lawn Cemetery in Siloam Springs. And to this day, his grave is covered with flowers, and his memory is honored every year with the annual Dalton Days celebration. But what about his headstone? His headstone says that he was killed on October 5th, 1892. But we already know that he was actually killed on September 14th, 1892. Well, his brother Bill was killed in the same shootout, but his body was never recovered, and he was unidentified until 1929 when bones were found near the Rock Island Railroad tracks in Crawford County, Kansas, and they were later identified as belonging to William Dalton by the help of DNA testing. So the headstone error may have come from confusion between the brothers. And the reason that Bob's remains ended up in an Oklahoma jail cell is because in 1921, the Oklahoma Historical Society requested that the governor of Arkansas allow them to take possession of his remains so they could put him on display at the Oklahoma State Fair in Oklahoma City. And the governor agreed. And then later, the remains were brought to the old Oklahoma jail in Tulsa, which is now the Oklahoma History Center. And then finally, in 2002, the remains were turned over to the Old Jail Museum in Perryton, Texas. And that's how the remains of famous outlaw Bob Dalton ended up in a tiny jail cell in the middle of the Oklahoma Panhandle. And if you ever visit the museum, you can see his remains in the cell next to mine. But before we go today, I want to remind you to please hit that subscribe button. We'd love to have you join us back here at the jail every week for a new episode. And don't forget to leave a comment below to let me know your thoughts about today's show. And now I'm going to leave you with one of my all-time favorite quotes from famous outlaw Butch Cassidy. And it's, "Don't bother with details. If the plan fails, there won't be any." Thank you for watching.